Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming David Leopold, who holds a doctorate from Humboldt University in Berlin. His dissertation, titled Bridging Memories on Contested Geographies, narrates historical experiences of violence and displacement for residents past and present in the greater Van region, thinking about how Turks, Kurds, and Armenians understood and remembered genocide and war, both across and within these three communities. David's diverse and really impressive linguistic competence allows him to examine the intersections between narrating, remembering, performing, not only Turks, Kurds, and Armenian memories, but others including Assyrians and the Yazidis. His comparative approach moves really beyond a narratology of memory, which is something we see much more common recently in the field of studying Armenians and Kurds in the region of Van, which I think is so refreshing about David's work. David's work is based on extensive field research in the Republic of Armenia and Eastern Anatolia among Armenians, Sunni Turks, Kurds, and Alevis. More particularly, he explores biographical trajectories, the politics of memory and collective boundaries in the region around Lake Van. A geography where collective violence stretches back continuously from the Armenian Genocide of 1915 to the Kurdish conflict that exists up to today. He reads Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish national narratives in a comparative vein, relying on an array of materials that include history textbooks, official publications, public speeches, and state museums. David, or David, as he tells me is the right pronunciation, has developed a novel typology, the four domains of the politics of memory, as he terms it, namely narrating, silencing, performing, renaming, and mapping, to carry out this impressive project. Today, you will hear more about David's innovative research. Please join me in warmly welcoming him.
Thank you. So what more could I add, actually? That's the big challenge now. And I think you're bound to be disappointed now from whatever you will hear. But I think I have to live with that. So first of all, I want to kind of warmly welcome you. And in the first few slides, I want to kind of bring you back to the year of 2015, the time when I conducted my fieldwork in Armenia. And we kind of like, first of all, walk through the streets. And if you walk through the streets in 2015 in Armenia, what was omnipresent were the slogans of the Armenian Genocide campaign, Hishumi of Bahanjum, which means like I remember and demand. And you would see things like this. For example, here the genocide 1915 composed of the murder tools, Vocha, Gortsikner, as you can see, the genocide axe, rope, rifle, and scimitar. Or we see other things who would argue Chinjalov, Urishi Patmotsiun, Cheskri, Sepakan, by erasing others' history, you do not write your own. Or here also, what I like particularly as a German, of course, I kind of like suggest a continuity between 1915 and what happened in 1939. So by preventing the first, we could have avoided the second to happen. And most obviously, Hayrekan, Yefaykakan hearts, Armenians exist, and so does the Armenian question. At the same time, below the surface, in the catacombs of the Yerevan Yeritasakan metro station, there was another kind of like complementing campaign, which was Tarva Lurutsyun, like 100 years of silence. And here we see like Ararat sketched in barbed wire fences with a hashtag that reads below, it's in small Western Armenia. And finally, a nationwide campaign that read Hayot Sehaspansion, Hetevankov, Millionaire Manokne, Luis Ashkari Chekan. A million children were not born because of the genocide, posing at specific critical, crucial spaces within Armenia. Here, for example, along the Arax River on the Turkish-Armenian border in the Shirak province, or with Nagorno-Karabakh veterans in forms of Khachkars in, for example, village of Kanakeveran, and maybe I think they're not toy Kalashnikovs. I think they might be real Kalashnikovs. So this is the kind of first flashes that will bring us to Armenia. At that time, I was visiting a fellow colleague who is also conducting fieldwork in a tiny Armenian village called Peshatavan, or formerly as it was known according to its Turkish name, Igdalu, according to Ide, which means silverberry trees in Turkish. While the village was mainly populated by a mix of Turkic, Kurdish, and Armenian population prior to the genocide, it was now mainly populated by Armenians and Yazidis who were expelled in 1915 from places like Paresh, Alashkert, Mush, or Kars. The white minibus drops me off right at the center of the village, right across of a Soviet-Armenian memorial to World War II, now refunctionalized as a memorial of the Nagorno-Karabakh War. Together, as we walked towards the southern outskirts of the village, suddenly the silence of the morning is broken by the rhapsodic voice calling from afar, distorted through loudspeakers. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu la ilaha illallah. So we have the Azan prayer, the prayer of the mosque, coming to us right from where the lofty and snow-covered mountains formation of Arat is towering at the horizon. Obviously, if the wind blows in the right direction, as it was at that day, you could clearly hear the Islamic prayer, as it's called Azan, right across the Arax River from the Alud or Yüzbaşılı Mosque in the neighboring village. In the blink of an eye, sound travels from one side of the closed and highly militarized border to the other side. Sometimes the Armenian side would also talk back, as for example in the night of April 24, the commemoration day of the Armenian Genocide, some residents of border villages like Peshatavan light tires and logwood at night, and the fires are visible as a silent testimony to the genocide on the other side of the border in Igdir and the areas around Turkey. For waves of people, however, the border remains hermetically sealed. In the diplomatic deadlock between Turkey and Armenia that followed the Nagorno-Karabakh War, only the only alternative route remains, which is the long land route via Georgia. On the other side of the border lies eastern Turkey, or in the eyes of many who claim their roots to it, Ergir or Armenian Hayastan, Western Armenia. However, it was not the voices of Armenian merchants or Syriac tradesmen that filled the streets of Van and Paresh in the year of 2015. Instead, the streets were filled with new voices, Turkish commands distorted in the megaphone of an armed jeep called infamously Akrep, the Scorpion, mingle with infuriated Kurdish chants, Berhuada Kobane, resistance in Kobane, or Habiji Serok Apo, long live our leader, in allusion to the imprisoned Kurdish leader Abdullah Öcalan. During my stay in Van later in 2015, late in that year, the silence of the night was also occasionally broken by the sounds of rifles and machine guns as young guerrilla fighters of the Yedigahash, a youth group loosely affiliated with the PKK, clashed with the Turkish military police. Yet, I would argue it is precisely these voices of anger and resent that in some way belie the words uttered a century ago by Talat Pasha when he was the arguably infamous architect of the Armenian deportation, who is quoted as, "The Armenian question does not exist anymore." Instead, the territorial contestation on the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire was not resolved in favor of a Turkish homeland, but the dispute continues now not only along the binary of an Armenian and Turkish homeland, but eventually of that of a Kurdish homeland, or Doza Kurdistane. While most research and journalistic work frame the Armenian issue and the Kurdish issue as two separate events that just merely coincided in the same geographical space, we want today in this talk rather focus on its interdependence of what we could call a fatally tied together people across both a spatial and temporal scale. Hereby, I would argue that we can identify two different ties, two different fatal ties. On the one hand, a tie of collaboration, Kurds constructed as victims in line with Armenians, and on the other hand, Kurds as partners in crimes against the Armenians. And first, as we follow the first line, this line of continuity stretches from the Armenian Genocide in 1915 to the Kurdish issue of our days. The Turkish historian Erdoğan Aydın, he argues that the Turkish state had borrowed from this ancient regime a similar notion of collective guilt. Like Ottoman Armenians, he argues, a century ago, Kurds are now suspected as a whole of separatism or bölücülük in Turkish, complicity with external forces, dış güçlerle işbirlikçilik, and finally high treason, devlete ihanet. And building on this argument, the imprisoned leader of the outlawed PKK, Abdullah Öcalan, tops this argument, arguing, while, I quote, while Armenians were subjected to genocide only once, Kurds were, I quote, always held at the brink of cultural genocide. Kültürel soykırım eşiğinde tutulur. And indeed, there's some historical, empirical, that does support this idea of a ties of co-victimhood. The ongoing Turkish-Kurdish conflict has shared some significant patterns with the violence perpetrated a century ago. In fact, the Turkish War of Liberation, or how it's called İstiklal Harbi in Turkish, had constituted the conditions for the creation of a Turkish homeland with borders stretching far beyond the largely Turkish-populated historical Anatolia, deep into the Armenian homeland and Mesopotamia. The war created, we could argue, a fait accompli on the Eastern question in favor of the Turkish cause. However, Turkey's authority over the largely Kurdish-populated provinces remained contested. It was found, as it is true for all imperial relations, on indirect, fragile alliances with tribal leaders. Following the proclamation of the Republic of Turkey, until today, we thus witness what I would read as a constant struggle of establishing absolute territorial sovereignty by breaking down recklessly regional cells, in this case of Kurdish autonomy. And this struggle between center and periphery, I argue, pitched Turks and Kurds against each other in a series of fratricidal conflicts. We can think, for example, of the Sheikh Zayed rebellion in 1925, Arad rebellion, which also resulted in a short-lived independent Kurdish state, 1927-1930, the Dersim massacres 1937-1938, that were very violently clashed by the state, and the Kurdish-Turkish conflict 1984 until today, we can say. Just I read that PKK a couple of days ago was announcing that they would ensue with new technology and the old conventional guerrilla warfare in an unprecedented manner, their demands also in the year of 2019, which was met with equally harsh responses by the Turkish side. And the interesting thing is, while the Kurdish national sentiment was largely oppressed in Turkey, particularly following the rebellions in the 1930s, the Southern Caucasus, and particularly the Armenian SSR, should become a laboratory for the exploration of new ideas of Kurdish culture and nationhood under the auspices of the Soviet Union. Here we see the movie Zare, already as early as 1926, the first feature film dedicated to Kurdish culture, titled Zare, as we see here, directed by Hamilbek Nazaryan, was produced in the Armenian SSR. Written by the Armenian author Abelazo, the main plot embeds the romantic love story of the main protagonist in the politically charged context of oppression of the Kurds, class conflicts, and the ordeals of First World War. The film critic Suren Hasmikyan remarks in this context that early movies on Kurds produced in the Armenian SSR were perceived as conceptual films, which represented an unvarnished East, in contrast to Oriental films, which depict Asia as a land of exotic wonders and horrors. Early Armenian films reflect the reality of day-to-day life and reveal the East as a knot of contradictions in which the chains of slavery and stagnant customs are slowly beginning to break. Previous movies within the Ottoman Empire were mainly composed of Sunni Muslim Kurds, when we take both the Ararat uprising of Yekbun and also the Sheikh Zayed rebellion. However, now it was the time for the non-Muslim branch of Kurdish speakers, the Yazidis, to play an active role in redefining what Kurdishness means in the 20th century. Together with their Muslim fellowmen, they paved the way for a more secular and inclusive Kurdish national movement, a movement capable of narrowing at the same time the gap between Kurdish speakers of Muslim and Yazidi faith. I would argue it would be very difficult to speak of a pan-Kurdish identity that would cross and transcend these religious boundaries prior to this period. The pioneered studies on Kurdish history and culture we can see is, for example, a first Latin alphabet developed by a group around the Yazidi novelist Arab Shamilov, and one of the first Kurdish newspapers ever produced, Riyad Taza, famous, which started publishing from the 1930s. As the print organ of the Kurdish section of the Communist Party of Armenia, it was initially published as a 4-page newspaper every 2 weeks. The editor during the early period was another notable figure of this community. It was the linguist and translator Jadoi Ganjo, who among others co-authored one of the first language instruction books on the Kurmanji dialect. It is the same dialect that is spoken by Kurds in Eastern Turkey today, which were financed and published again by the Armenian SSR. We have here the Kitab el-Zaman Kurmanji. This is the second edition. There was a first edition published in 1935 too. And we see here, for example, also the challenging of old gender roles. Here, Daikamin Furendachi, my mother is a pilot who is flying Belin Defirile Asmani, who is flying in the skies. I mean, we speak here not about the 1990s, we speak here about the 1937 in Soviet Armenia, right? Here also, Zawadida in the factory, and the rainbow is another small poem. But at the same time, to move on to this shared experience of forced expulsion and destitution during 1915, we see also that something else happens. It's not only, and we're going to come to this like in a second, it is not only that the boundaries between that were dividing Kurdish speakers of Yazidi faith and Muslim faith were becoming more and more challenged. It is also the boundaries between Armenians and Kurdish-speaking Yazidis on the other hand. And in this sense, particularly, we can speak of a shared experience of forced expulsion and destitution during the 1915, which I can also elaborate more in the discussion, to which Yazidi writers like, for example, the literary critic Askeri Boyek in his Kurdish work, Nura Alagyazı Çendidemci Edebiyatı Kurdin Ermenistani, is referring to, The Light of Alagyaz, some observations on the literature of the Kurds of Armenia. In this work, I think he's kind of summarizing well the kind of glue on a narrative level that is bringing together Armenians and Yazidis in the Soviet period. He argues, the Yazidi Kurds of Sumulu, Kars and Van, like the Armenians, were subjected to massacres, were expelled, expropriated, and when they arrived on the Araratian plainlands, Deshta Revane in Kurdish, they faced scarcity, disease, and poverty. So this is a shared experience of destitution that further also is essential in creating bonds of solidarity, not only among Kurdish speakers in Armenia, but also between the majority Armenian population and the Yazidi minority in Armenia. As a result of this affirmative cultural policies of the Soviet Union, the Kurds of the Caucasus, one could argue, and I say this with the words of Monty Melkonyan, they reached a level of national self-determination far beyond that of Kurds in any part of the Kurdish homeland. And this made them also more self-determined in another field too, which is that of rock music. The band Komawatan, which translates the band of Homeland, founded in 1973 in neighboring the Georgian SSR, by Soviet Kurdish musicians around Kerem Gendenzeri, would enter world history as arguably one of the first Kurdish rock bands. And we can have a small, you can tune in. This is from a later album, so this is not from 1973. Alagyaz is one of the most highly populated Kurdish regions within nowadays Armenia, known as Alagyaz, also in Armenian. But the story doesn't end here. There's another line of complicity which also ties Kurdish and Armenians together, that of perpetratorhood. It links the irrevocable erasure of Ottoman Armenians to the emergence of an imagined northern Kurdistan, Bakuri Kurdistan in Kurdish, stretching over once largely substantially Armenian populated areas. Prior to 1915, Kurds had shared the region with Syriacs and Armenians in an area that was like multi-ethnically composed. Only after the genocidal policies that unfolded in the wake of World War I, a remaining Kurdish population would emerge as a crushing majority now in the region. So ironically, we observe that the very policies designed to pave the way for a Turkish homeland, Türk-Yurdu, in the east, concentrated the remaining Kurdish population now as a critical majority. This, in turn, one could argue, elicited unintentionally the demand for incorporation of the region into an imagined northern Kurdistan. Or, to put it in simpler terms, without the genocide, it would be very difficult to imagine dreams of northern Kurdistan in cities like Kars or Van. The Kurdish national movement in itself, and we're going to discuss this on multi-levels, both on institutional and also personal level, has, I would argue, only partially addressed this issue. In what I call in my own work a force majeure myth, so I'm kind of dissecting the different national myths that inform the stories of 1915 in the Armenian, Turkish and Kurdish historiography. We can discuss also the myths that I do distinguish with regard to the Armenian and Turkish case in the following discussion. I would argue that that we have in the Kurdish narrative a force majeure myth. So it relies heavily on socialist rhetoric, mainly with the aim to externalize the question of responsibility. As 1915 is understood merely as an imperial game, its perpetrators, young Turks and collaborationist Kurds, are demasked as merely the subaltern of a larger system of oppression, which is termed as capitalist modernity. It's the same notion in Turkish. The project for creating a monolithic Turkish nation state is put thus in a wider context of a baleful global development that, I quote, erased from the surface the cultural heritage and values of millennia. The Armenian genocide is recognized in the Kurdish narrative as such and is seen as a terrific example, yet not as an exceptional example. Instead, it is seen in a continuity with a long-reaching history of, I quote, countless massacres of ethnicities and nations, end of the quote. Behind the genocide are identified imperialist aspirations, reckless economic interests, and this is a quote from Öcalan's letter to the Armenian people published in 2014, racist nationalist currents as the ideological backbone of these policies. However, there's one blind spot that the official narrative, and we have to distinguish here really carefully. I'm not talking about the general discourse, and we're going to discuss this in more detail, that is going on among critical-minded Kurds today. I'm talking about based on the careful reading of the official text. There, we see that one story is not told, and that is those of Kurdish perpetrators and their motives in engaging in the Armenian genocide. Instead, the general statement, and I quote here Öcalan from his work, Demokratik Uygarlık Manifesto, which is the manifesto of a democratic civilization. He's asked, with regard to 1915, while annihilating each other, the people were not all aware whom they were serving, end quote. This is the explanation. In fact, while many national-minded Kurdish researchers and politicians sympathize to Kurdish cause are eager to openly recognize the Armenian genocide as such, and basically as a crime committed by the Turkish state, this particular complex of topics, the topics of perpetratorhood or ishtirak, has remained still on a larger scale, widely unaddressed. However, pioneering works by historians like Ferhat Aydınkaya, and there are many others here which we have in recent publications. For example, this is the book Utanç ve Onur, so it's like shame and honor, published in 2015, precisely at the centennial of the Armenian genocide. They started to recognize in a very strong way the role of ordinary Kurds in the unfolding of 1915. Quoting Aydınkaya from his article here, essay here in this book, any evaluation of the genocide that does not recognize the role of ordinary Kurds is faulty and is insufficient. So this is about moving beyond recognizing Kurds only within the framework of Hamidiye regiments. Instead, the events of 1915 mark not only a novelty in the region, but in terms of violence, also a recurrence, admittingly on a far larger scale. In the regions of Mush, Mardin, Diyarbakir, again Kurdish notables actively engaged with the central government. whether the Saydenato Çetesinmuş or the paramilitaries led by Cendemeyin Beyjik or Mustafa Bey around Diyarbakir, local non-state actors played not merely a complementary, but instead instrumental role in the killings, he argues. The local clergy did their part in legitimizing the genocide through fatwas, agitating the masses that participated for their own gains, while at the same time imams that rejected the tekfir were subjected to persecution by the state. So we have here a very ambivalent also case. While the land, toprak ve araziler, remained mostly in the hand of state-sponsored Hamidian elites, the share of ordinary Kurds were movable good or other tangible assets. Instead, however, this behavior should not appear to us as something that we would use in order to reproduce a very ready imaginary of the terrible Turk or the terrible Kurd. Instead, it is rather reminiscent of a universal phenomenon that the socialist Ren Collins calls the moral holiday, with regard to his observations of post-riot situations in general. And he makes his most argument with regards to the actually killings of civilian populations by American soldiers in the Vietnam War. He argues as valid laws of conduct and ethnic collapse, even non-affiliated bystanders are torn into a frenzy of pillaging and marauding. But as it is true for other cases of genocide and ethnic cleansing, assessing the actual role of the wider population remains an incredibly difficult task. Historians like, for example, Professor Sunni, who is present here, rightly observes that genocide in particular is an event of mass killing with massive numbers of victims, but not necessarily massive numbers of killers. The idea of a great discrepancy between large numbers of victims and a small quantity of perpetrators is actually also backed by some sources, primary sources that are available to us on 1915. So we have, for example, the quote of a German administrator, Verweser, of Erzurum, Scheubner Richter, not particularly known as a very Armenophile person, who speaks of 10, I quote directly from German translated, 10,000 of Armenians allowing themselves to be massacred by a small number of Kurds and bandits, end quote. Which he also interprets, by the way, I quote again, a proof for how little belligerent, Kampfroh in German, and revolutionary these people are. I think there are very few quotes that more undermine the Turkish myth of a large-scale Armenian uprising than this one does. And again, this man is specifically, he on other occasion compares Armenians in a very, very disparaging way with Jews. And if a German like Scheubner Richter compares Armenians to Jews, that doesn't mean something good. So, summing up with the words of Aydin Kaya, we could argue, without Kurdish complicity, it would have been not so easy to purge Armenians from the Armenian Kurdish hinterland. So, as we see this, in light of the threefold contested geography that we have been exploring, Eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, or Northern Kurdistan respectively, the region appears to us as a complex puzzle. It is as complex as the relationship that fatally ties the two people, subject, together, which is Kurds and Armenians mainly. Opposing lines of both perpetrator and victimhood connect them to each other, and finally to 1915. However, boundaries between historical perpetrators and victims are less rigid than they actually seem. As Recep Maraşlı put it, Kurds today are, I quote, children of both perpetrators and victims alike. As a matter of fact, particularly, but not exclusively among Kurdish families, we observe the widespread phenomenon of the Islamized Armenians, so the Islamist grand-grandmother, mostly of Armenian or Syriac origin. These women survived 1915-1916 and lived as converts in Muslim families as relative grandmothers, mothers condemned to a life deprived of language and voice. I quoted here Recep Maraşlı, famous human rights activist in exile in Germany. So, and here I want to provide you also with one personal and actual example, which is the sample of a good friend of mine who agreed for this to be shared. It is one of my closest Kurdish friends with whom I did study at university when I was learning Turkish in Izmir. And he knew since 2 years, I think. 2 years? It's Since last year, it is possible actually to request your genealogical tree from the Turkish government, which is a project that was very controversially discussed within Turkey. And he himself already knew that because of some lingual fragments that he picked up, so some Syriac words, that he had some non-Kurdish family members. So we can, I wanted to show this and to bring this in as an actual personal and existing example. He's himself born in Batman, and the relatives I marked are direct relatives that are of Syriac origin, which is basically makes his mother already half Syriac. And the interesting thing is what we see here, these two family members did marry already in the post-Threefold period. Threefold is the word Syriacs employ to describe the massacres perpetrated against Syriacs during the same period, or actually a couple of years later also. And the interesting thing is that we see also a continuity of community relations in the aftermath of 1915, because these are people of Syriac origin that do survive the genocide and that continue to live in the region, and actually that continue against all odds to maintain intercommunal bonds to the degree that they find again Syriacs with whom they marry in the area around Beshiri. Although we should take the Dom Yeres, or the place of birth, with cautious, because this is all based on the information that was provided to the state officer that then takes down these notes. So I know from some places, due to his own family stories, that not all the place of origin fully overlap. So we also should take this information with a grain of salt. But what is for sure is we see the names, they are also not of Kurdish origin. And the interesting thing is that this is not just an exceptional family tree. And the truth with which we have to come to terms with in Turkey, this is actually the average family tree. This is not an exception. And this is, in this regard, from a good friend of mine. I'm very indebted to him that he granted the permission for me to show this. In addition to this, we see that actually what seemed like a rigid divide between victim and perpetrator does factually coalesce into one family tree among many families in the region of Eastern Turkey. So we see at the same time, while being co-perpetrators and brothers in arms with the Young Turks, as we elaborated on before with regard to the fatal ties of perpetratorhood, that at the same time present-day Kurdish citizens of Turkey now find themselves bearing the full brunt of the ongoing conflict, as was elaborated also by the Turkish Kurdish historian Aydin Erdogan. And that is still ongoing, the conflict between the PKK and the Turkish state. Thus, the common Kurdish saying that goes, they had Armenians for breakfast and us for lunch, while of course not fully corresponding to the accepted historical reality, shows still illustratively this shift in perception away from a history that glorifies the hegemon to a history that rehabilitates resistance. Yet, the present moment marks, if only the twilight in a long and painful process towards challenging established notions of official historiography, which I am doing in large in my work. Of course, I'm unable to discuss all the aspects of my work in detail here in this presentation, but I'm very happy to delve more into other aspects, particularly the aspects of oral history interviews I conducted in the ensuing discussion. Only, I would argue, a fundamental revision will redeem from the quest for justice the ghosts that continue to haunt the descendants in Armenia and the diaspora today, as they find their final resting place in a new narrative that can now be shared across the victim and perpetrator divide. However, it takes firmer steps on both sides to achieve an upright disentanglement from two acquainted narratives of national self-victimization and the resulting Frankfurt constellations. Or in the word of Jan Werner Müller, a shared truth might be impossible as long as political opponents remain trapped in collective memories of trauma and victimhood, or alternatively, in the defensiveness and self-righteousness of the perpetrators. End quote. The present stalemate thus oddly resonates these words of another researcher, Mark Mazover, who rightly observed that, I quote, "Sometimes it is easier to dream the old dreams, even when they are nightmares, than to wake up to unfamiliar realities. While we know from Walter Benjamin that only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past, overlaying prisms of national exclusivism, wow, difficult word, exclusivism, not so difficult, continue to obscure the pain suffered by the seemingly other. For Jan Wennemüller, engaging with a difficult history means, I quote, trading the fine line between recognizing the dignity of collective historical experiences and in particular shared suffering, and being sold vindictive myths about ancient quarrels or blessing collective amnesia. And indeed, until this day, the geography known as Eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, or Northern Kurdistan is construed by many as an embattled dreamland, where mythic battles between good and evil could be fought, lost, or won. While reviling dreams of ancient national homelands continue to haunt the minds of those living in the conflict-ridden geography of Mesopotamia, the national awakenings that spread across the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century reappeared to us now, living in the 21st century and looking back, ultimately not as dreams, but as nightmares, echoing the desperate call of Pessoa's, the famous Portuguese writer's heteronym Álvaro de Campos. For those who are familiar with Pessoa's writing, he knows he's like famous in creating different pseudonyms for himself in which he explores different parts of his personality. He asks Álvaro de Campos, when will I awake from being awake? In alignment to the call for national awakening. The call to wake up from dreams of national awakenings means to embrace the geography again as what it had been historically, as a shared space of cohabitation. Being able to imagine a world different from this one, haunted by the dreams of ethno-national particularism, is hereby more than just a utopian vision. It is the essential precondition for a revised understanding of history, an understanding of history that allows us to embrace the quest for historical justice as a joint cause that unites rather than divides the descendants of victims and perpetrators. However, this may necessitate the ultimate decline of also the economic system as we know it right now. That is the practice by the ruling classes, as we see, of deliberately dividing people by nationality, race, ethnicity, or religion at the expense of a different understanding that the ghosts that haunt this geography, Northern Kurdistan, Western Armenia, or Eastern Turkey, will be redeemed and find their resting place now in a new and undivided humanity. Coming to the end. Inspired by his own experience of serving 12 years in jail as a political prisoner, Nazım Hikmet published upon his release in 1915 a series of poems called After Leaving the Prison, Hapisten Çıktıktan Sonra. In the second poem, he takes the reader along the evening walk, Akşam Gezintisi in Turkish, of a released prisoner roaming through his native Anatolian village at twilight. As a result of ongoing tight censorship in Turkey, the poem has been republished over a period of half a century with -5 of its original lines. So 5 lines were removed from this poem. Only in 2000 the previously removed lines would then finally reappear in a Turkish publication. I'll read them first in Turkish and then I will end by reading them in English. Bakkal Karapet'in ışıkları yanmış. Affetmedi bu emini vatandaş, Kürt dağlarında babasının kesilmesini. Fakat seviyor seni çünkü sen de affetmedin bu karaya sürenleri Türk halkının alınına. The lights of Karapet's convenience store were still burning. He, this Armenian citizen, has not forgiven that his father was massacred in the Kurdish mountains. But he loves you because you also have not forgiven those who brought shame on the Turkish people. I thank you.
Thank you, David. Would you take your own questions?
Sure. I think now we can really delve into the real discussion. That was just the intro.
Those beautiful lines of poetry.
So, yeah.
David, that was brilliant. It was really wonderful. And I got chills at the end with that poem. It's amazing. So give us just a tiny taste of the Turkish narrative. That is, this is a 3-way contest, you said, right?
Yeah.
So it's Western Armenia, Northern Kurdistan, and Eastern Anatolia are part of the Turkish homeland or Vatan or whatever. So is there both an official and a more popular narrative that are contesting, or what do you have there?
I think that's a very fascinating topic, particularly on an official level. I feel more easier to to respond to that. The interesting thing what we see is that there is also a certain evolution, and a good way of tracing this evolution is to see how it is mirrored in history textbooks. When we take early Turkish history textbooks, the topic actually in itself would not be present there. So when we look at the evolution of Turkish history textbooks and how they actually deal with 1915, we have an interesting kind of narrative. So initially, those stories are simply not part of the canon. Then they appear, but at the same time, partially the violence is explained, but at the same time it is justified by the evil and treacherous intentions of Armenians. And then we see slowly after the 50s, and that's interesting, we see more and more how this notion of genocide as a universal term that is outlawed is emerging on a global scale. And then we see a turning back. Suddenly, no, these things actually didn't happen. These things were, if they did happen, then Armenians killed us. So we have it directly in the current Turkish lise, so in the high school textbooks, we have a direct reversal of the numbers. So it says that while a number of 150,000 Armenians died from respiratory diseases and alike diseases during 1915, Armenians killed around 300,000 Turks and forced 1 million Turks into exile. This is a direct quote from the Turkish history text. I think that gives a good idea. And another, which I found more interesting, because the denialist attitude, that is known. But what is more interesting is how Armenians and also Kurds enter the stage of history textbooks at a very late stage. So when we talk about the Ottoman Empire, there's this chapter that is Osmanlılar Dünya Gücü, so the Ottoman Empire world power. There is no reference, and I counted, there is no reference to Armenians and Kurds at all. They don't exist at the time when the Ottoman is its heydays, the glorious days. They enter the stage as alien elements, suddenly in the 19th century, trying to secede from the empire, which is interesting because how can groups undermine empire when they were not initially even part of the empire? And I think this is, if you want to kind of pinpoint the actual, what is at the nexus of the Turkish historiography as we see it right now, then it is this contradiction between a Armenian Kurdish people that did not exist, but that then suddenly enter the stage as hostile and dangerous elements. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this very interesting talk, David. Actually, I have a very quick question about this part, about the sounds, music, ezan, and other sounds that came up in different parts of your talk. I think that was very fascinating in terms of thinking about the geography we are talking about. So you talked about the sound of ezan that you can hear from the other side of the border, and then this rock music, but also there are absence of certain sounds, right? I mean, you can see, I mean, you can't hear Armenian words or songs in the same geography anymore. So I was wondering, in your general, larger project, where do these sounds, how do they inform your reading of these contested geographies, if they do at all, or where do they stand in the ways in which you imagine these contested geographies and also these memories that coming together or sometimes contesting one another, if it makes sense?
I'm not sure whether we'll be able to answer this question well, because that would be a longer discussion, right? But the reason why I actually picked specifically the Azan as a beginning was not only that I personally experienced it, but actually, and we could develop this further, there is another puzzle behind that. Because over 100 years ago, prior also to the magnificent demographic changes that happened in the Southern Caucasus, ironically, we could have imagined the Ezan leaving from what is nowadays the Armenian side, which had been largely populated by Kurds and Turkey populations in the area of Armavir, going over to what is now the Turkish side, but was also largely populated by Armenians. The village I was working on, I know that according to a Russian ethnographer who visited the region of Yerevan and Echmiadzin, in the end of the 19th century. We know that one mosque did exist in the very village that is now the Armenian village I was talking about, Ikdalu, now known as Peshatavan. So when we kind of take on this kind of like allegory on voices and sounds, the interesting thing is also once we kind of embed it in a larger temporal perspective, the sounds would actually travel from one direction in the other, and they would reverse their direction. And this is, I think, what tells very powerful the story of forced demographic change, of population engineering that haunted the region and is continuing to haunting the region from the 19th century up until today. Thanks so much. Yeah?
So thank you, David. And I was wondering whether if we focus more on pronouns, right?
Yeah.
And in particular, the slippage that you talked about between victim and perpetrator, a sentence from your own friend's testimony about we are both victims and perpetrator. And then you went on to talk about his consciousness through slippages of language where he was already aware that he had Syriac background before even there was that genealogy, pedigree that was there.
Yeah.
Clearly, who's the we? And when you say, who is the we, and when Nazim Hekmat says, refers to the Armenians, or where you had this joke about, the Armenians are eaten for breakfast and us, the Kurds, are eaten for lunch. So can we problematize it maybe with some of the kinds of ethnographic work that you've done to think about these pronouns?
Definitely, yeah. So first of all, just about the quote itself. The quote itself was not from my friend, but that was from Recep Marishli, the human rights activist. And he's mentioned it in a context. It was an event that I was also co-organizing, where I was translating, where basically members of the Kurdish and Armenian community in Berlin were coming together. It was one of the kind of rare first events where these communities would actually come together in an official framework and commemorate the genocide together. And when he was using we, he was with his own background very much involved in the Kurdish movement as such. So he was referring to those Kurds who are actually politically active, both in Turkey and abroad. But this is just for the quote. The question on a larger scale is more difficult. And I think this is also at the core of my actual research that is of ethnographic nature, which I couldn't discuss here because in the end it's 40 minutes. There, the interesting thing, and this is one of my core arguments in my research, is that when we think of collective memory and the way how people remember, then we see that what we means is a noun that does change rapidly according to which they might refer to. So, for example, I give the example of it's kind of constructed example in my theoretical part, but I construct this Luzine Orinakyan, which doesn't exist but could exist. And we could think of her coming when we take the four prisms that I developed, so ideology, locality, temporality, and genealogy. So for example, if I would request from her to tell us, so what is basically, where do you stand politically? She could remember that she's actually a member of the Destitution, and she could remember with anger and much relief how she was burning Turkish flags prior to the day of the genocide. At the same time, once we assume another stance, asking about her family, suddenly she might remember, well, actually there were stories where my family, when they were expelled, were actually saved by Kurds, by Armenians. So suddenly the we is changing, and also what is the in and out boundary is changing, right? And then you move to another level. You move to the level of temporality. Again, temporality, we speak about a person that was deprived of her childhood because she's born into the beginning of the 90s. So again, she could remember with much hatred and contempt how Azeris, who are of course in Armenian perceived as an extension of Turks, so that how they basically kind of destroyed her prospect for a sheltered childhood. But then on a fourth level again, we could think of locality. I could ask her, so basically, what's the place you're living in? And then she could remember, well, actually this Orinaka Kert, or we could call it Pshatavan or other villages in Aragasutun, well, it was actually a place where elders say that Turkic population, Muslim populations, and Armenians lived side by side in relative harmony during the Soviet period. So this is what I mean actually with the four prisms I introduced, that is designed to challenge what we normally see as a homogeneous collective narrative of the nation. So the problem is often when we speak of collective memory, which I avoided throughout my talk, we normally actually see this as synonymous with national collective memory. And I think this is important. In my argument, we need more studies that do explore collective memories, memory as a collective phenomenon, but beyond the configuration of the national.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Other question, maybe remarks? So, yeah, Omar?
Yeah, kind of immediately building on that, because it was part of your point that that there is all these kinds of entanglements between practices of memory and sort of governance, right? Institutions, the kind of institutions there. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about the kind of transition that you sort of identify as already starting. What's the institutional aspect of it, and is there an institutional element of it, or
to memory, or
to this sort of transition that you were describing as occurring in the present, right? Sort of this, this let's say new field of memory where victimhood and perpetration can live side by side, right? Which I wonder, what kind of institutions can reflect that kind of politics, right? And especially thinking of the danger of sort of, shooting the messenger, right? And the dangers that academic institutions themselves undergo precisely because of this sort of betrayal of the nationalist narrative, right? So where does that leave us, right?
Yeah. I think with regard to this, the biggest challenge is somehow ironic. I mean, for many years, it seemed as if in Turkey the problem was of not being able to create a space for the narrative of the victim. The victim in the sense of Armenians themselves, curse themselves as a kind of descendant of the victims. I think I would argue when you again continue with the notion of a unified family tree that links both to perpetrator and victim, the problem, the trend that I see that is problematic is that now it seems a reversal in which Kurdish imaginary is reimagined only through the lens of being the descendants of the victim. And this is problematic because an actual coming to terms with history can only happen if those, particularly who live in Eastern Turkey today, can be able and are able to find a way of both accommodating the experience of victimhood and perpetratorhood. Whereas one could argue up until the 1970s, 1980s, it was very popular to actually even take pride in a continuity of perpetratorhood. Many people would speak with much elevation about how they killed up to 7-8 Armenians during 1915. It fully reversed. But this reversal, in my opinion, should not happen to the degree that the elements of perpetratorhood cannot be voiced anymore, because we need both. If suddenly whole Eastern Turkey reinvents itself as descendants of victims, this will not lead, to my understanding, to an actual critical engagement with history, because history means to embrace both experiences of perpetratorhood and victimhood as part of our own history. Coming to the institutional question, because that was your question, I think this is very much dependent with regard to Turkey on also the domestic dynamics, as you should know, whether there can as such emerge a space beyond communal segregation, right? I mean, one attempt was HDP, of course, or is like the Kurdish party that was founded in the aftermath of the rebranding, so to say, after the aftermath of Gezi Park. But I would argue the failure of HDP to actually transcend the national boundaries that seem to persist in Turkey is very closely tied up with this question. If an organization, a party like HDP could, which is called Halkların Demokratik Parti, so it's like, the party of the democratic peoples, if such a, let's say, pan-national project can succeed, that would also mean, I think, that there's an institutional framework for bringing together these two narratives. So I think it's very closely tied up with this question, and with regard to Turkey, I can say. Yeah. Any other remarks? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just a
question,
question
yeah.
about the methodological approach to complexify that relationship you're talking about. Because you do field work and using a lot of popular media.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering
Yeah.
how, if you see a tension between those two.
Yeah.
Right? Very basic question, do you see a difference when you would, ask people, right? When you do field work, you conduct an interview, and then when you will watch a film or listen to those music, how does it say something different to you, or do you come to the same conclusion? You see what I mean? Because you seem to be interested in different forms of object that
Yeah.
kind of confirm that complicated relationship of,
Yeah.
movement. So I'm wondering about, the role of those different popular media. Because they seem to be more than illustrative, right? Or symptomatic. There is something more going on.
Yeah, I think in this regard, I'm trying to move now to Armenia because we have been speaking too much, I think, about Eastern Turkey so far. But in close to the question you were raising, I think that it's very interesting to take different elements of pop culture, also or mainstream culture in Armenia, and to raise the question in how far the other is recognized. And I think the interesting thing is I would take two different things, and this will be very provocative, but to compare today's Rabbi's music culture and Sayed Nova on the other hand. And for me, these two are kind of like, in some regard, very striking examples for a different perception of how the other is perceived within, for example, culture in Armenia. You can make this argument for other societies easily too. Because on the one hand, for those who are not familiar, Sayed Nova, famous Armenian poet, famous for writing not only in Armenian, but as he was living at the Georgian court, also in Azerbaijani Turkish and in Georgian, while most probably he was also fluent in Persian, I guess, because most of his imaginary from what he draws is Persian tasawwuf, like Sufi literature. And the interesting thing is that it is fully recognized his language is actually just full of Persian Arabic loanwords, but still it is recognized as something that an Armenian could take pride in. But the interesting thing is there's an ongoing culture that basically particularly flourished with the beginning of the 90s, although it emerged earlier, which is like the Rabbi's culture, which is somehow the closest equivalent could be maybe like Blatnoy culture in Russia. So the idea of music that is shared by the working classes, by the kind of stereotypical image would be what the music that the truck driver listens to when he goes from Yerevan to Rostov-na-Don. And the interesting thing is, however, that they have a specific culture of code switching. So there are video recordings where they would come together and sing, starting singing in Armenian, then switching in Russian. It's improvised singing, accompanied by cheap keyboard sounds, mixing to Georgian, and then incorporating also Azerbaijani. So this is the interesting thing is one could argue, easily argue about the aesthetic value of this music. What is interesting, however, to my knowledge, it is one of the very few genres that do exist in the field of music where the Turkish other is nowadays still present in Armenia. So this is, I think, also very interesting, what we do perceive as culture that does challenge the norms that we live in. Because there are, of course, also other examples we could find, like Collective Metz Bazaar, for example, an Armenian band founded by Armenians and Turks in Paris, which I very much love. But I think the reach of these bands are very limited. They are limited to people who are anyways very similar in terms of thoughts, I think. So in that sense, I think it should also kind of encourage us to think a bit beyond what we normally perceive as spheres from which change should come. That doesn't, but at the same time, of course, without idealizing it, because the very same person that might sit at the table in the evening singing, improvising together in Turkish, in Azeri Turkish, Russian or Armenian, might not necessarily be less belligerent when it comes to fighting Azerbaijanis at the Nagorno-Karabakh border. So things are more complicated. It's not like so. But I think particularly with regard to music culture, which is something that I was focusing on in another article, I think it is interesting that you see a strong discrepancy also between rhetoric speech and then action with regard to performances, which is an interesting field for further explorations, I think.